Hello AP World History students, welcome. We got another flip video lesson here. This one is about India under the Mughal Empire, yet another high period in Indian history, this one happening during period 4. So the Mughals, the Mughals were another Muslim empire ruling in India. This is after the Delhi Sultanate. The Mughals were outsiders. In this case, they were from Central Asia. The founder of the Mughal Empire is actually a guy who is a descendant of Tamerlane and Genghis Khan on the different sides of his family. And so this is a Central Asian power coming in and establishing itself. They are Muslims, and artistically, aesthetically, they're very influenced by the Persians. And as time goes on, they became more and more Persian. The Mughal Empire is one of the 3 so-called gunpowder empires, these really large Muslim empires in the Middle East and Central Europe and South Asia that remained kind of dominant during this period of time. And so the things we're going to look at here, we're going to look at the cultural ties of the Mughal Empire and the mix that it has, and we're going to look specifically at this question of how did Muslim Mughal rulers rule over a predominantly Hindu nation, and how did that express itself? The Mughal period is one of the high periods in Indian artistic history, and India has a number of artistic highlights already. But in the Mughal period, the Mughal emperors were so this was a wealthy place. You know, the Indian Ocean Trade Network. There's even some very early industrial development happening during this time, and there's a lot of money, and there is just a great deal of art happening and architecture. And the image that you see, the women engaged in dancing, that's very influenced by the Persians. It's also got a Hindu influence or an old Indian influence in the sense that it has some, it's sort of a suggestive image. And that certainly is not Muslim to sort of have an image like that. That's an older Indian kind of influence. But the Mughal rulers were patrons of the arts. The most famous probably image of Indian art in this period of time comes from the Taj Mahal, and we'll look at that in a second. What we see Mughal rulers doing here is what rulers in many other parts of the world were also doing with increasing notoriety in this period, and that's what I refer to here as the political use of art and architecture. That is, architecture to show off your power. You build the Taj Mahal, ostensibly as a mausoleum to your ex-wife, but really to show I did this and I, King Welle can do this. It's the same reason why the palace at Versailles is built, or the Tsar's summer palace at St. Petersburg is built. Like you build this to create something that no history book can wipe away. You create this to make something that's going to last and that your enemies cannot take away. And it's going to legitimize you as well. Typically, these are kind of cloaked with all sorts of religious artwork and religious imagery, and that's going to sort of reinforce your rule. So we see a lot of this happening, and the Mughals were certainly no exception. This first image that I'm showing you here, this palace, you can get some sense of the scale of it and just how enormous it is. I'll move on to the more famous example, and that's the Taj Mahal. I think you saw this in your reading, but Shah Jahan, who was the ruler who created this, built it as a mausoleum, a memorial to his wife, who died in childbirth. And then famously, he was deposed, and the next ruler, AURANGZEB, who we'll learn about in a second here, AURANGZEB didn't kill Shah Jahan. Instead, he imprisoned him in this high tower, and the only way that he could see his creation of the Taj Mahal was sort of looking out a window, but through a mirror. He could see the reflection of it, and he would spend his final lonely days doing that. So all kinds of sadness built into this. This is not a mosque, although with the minarets you could be fooled, right? It's not a mosque. What it just is stunningly beautiful. We also see the Islamic tradition where it's not, the artwork associated with it and built into it is not venerating images of people. it's the written word. I mean, we could just make the whole lesson just be stare at this or look at close-ups of this and analyze, and that really wouldn't actually be a bad lesson. Maybe we'll try something like that. But you can get something if you go Mughal India. That's the Taj Mahal. That's okay. I'll take that. That's okay. One of the dynamics that pops out at us from this period of Mughal India is a new syncretic religious tradition. Remember, syncretism is the kind of mix and match, creating the breakfast burrito idea. The Mughals did not introduce Islam to India. Of course, it had been there before with the Delhi Sultanate, but at a certain point, when these two religions are there together, Islam and Hinduism, what we start to see created is a new syncretic tradition called Sikhism. And Sikhism is a blending of Hinduism and Islam. I want us to learn about this because A, it's a really good example of religious syncretism. B, there's no small number of Sikhs in the world today. There are millions today, including Sikhs in the United States. And B, I just think it's a good bit of kind of cultural citizenship to know who these guys are. You know, Americans, if they know about Sikhs at all, they say, oh, are those the guys with the long beards? Or who have their hair in turbans or the long hair? And the answer is, yeah, sure, yeah, that's those guys. The biggest thing that Sikhism took from Islam is a rigid monotheism and an egalitarianism that kind of rejects the caste system. A lot of the other ideas come from Hinduism. It incorporates the idea of reincarnation. There is a common meditation, the kind of droning meditation, Eastern-style meditation is practiced by Sikhs. There's this idea that's very Eastern as well, that the whole world is an illusion, and we just need to learn to see beyond that. So turn off your YouTube videos, young people, and turn off your computers. It's all an illusion. It'll be on the test, but it's an illusion. I can't tell you the reason behind the cutting their hair thing. I'll just say that it's a thing. And so if you see a man with a long beard and hair tied up in a turban, you're likely looking at a Sikh man. Sikhism was founded by a man whose title was Guru Nanak. A guru was like a religious teacher. Sikhism started off during the Mughal Empire, the 1600s. It starts off as a small, peaceful religious minority. As time passes, they face more hostility from the Mughal rulers. You know, the Mughal rulers have, we'll see in a moment, a fairly tolerant way of approaching the Hindu majority in India. However, a new religion that's kind of a heretical offshoot of Islam, they weren't nearly so friendly toward, and so the Mughal rulers were they persecuted the Sikhs, and the Sikhs respond by kind of creating a sort of a militarized subculture. And so interestingly, Sikhism becomes associated with a kind of a warrior mentality, and these Khalsa warriors, these sort of religious warriors for Sikhism. And eventually they kind of fight and scrap out their own semi-autonomous kingdom within India. I mean, eventually India, at the end of the Mughal Empire, is going to break into all kinds of semi-autonomous regions, and then eventually, later on, the British East India Company is going to come in and scoop them all up. But one of those, and a notorious one, was a Sikh kingdom. And eventually, the British are going to be able to use the Sikhs as a minority that's helpful to them. You know, oh, you guys don't like these Muslim rulers? Say, well, we can help you. Why don't you help us instead? And so there were Sikh, the Sikhs joined the British Army. There were Sikhs fighting for Great Britain in World War I, and all that sort of thing. Today, there's 30 million Sikhs. There was an incident that I'm reminded of in Wisconsin. Where someone, one of these ignorant people who's like, there's too many Muslims, right? One of these guys. So he was just mad about all the Muslims in the United States today. So, he went ahead and burned down a Sikh temple because that makes sense. And then, later it's like, well, you see, Muslims aren't Sikhs. But anyway, yeah, there's actually a Sikh temple in Bloomington that I drive by occasionally. That's why I'm teaching this to you right now. Just so we have a little bit more kind of cultural awareness of what's going on around us and who are these guys. Anyway, back to our thread, back to Mughal India. There's two noteworthy Mughal rulers that I want to bring up, and one kind of represents what's understood as a high period, and that is Akbar, or Akbar the Great. And one guy is given a tough bit of duty toward the period, the tail end of the Mughal Empire, and his name is Aurangzeb, and they represent different approaches to Muslim rule over a Hindu majority society. Akbar the Great pops up in our class a lot. He represents a leader of a large empire who has a profound religious conscience and a deep interest in religion, in his case Islam, who is tolerant of other religions and kind of ecumenical in his approach, like looking to find common ground and ways that society could be bettered through the bringing together of different religious groups. Akbar is a Sufi Muslim. Now we know Sufi Muslims are not the ones who are enamored with all the finer points of the creeds of Islam and all the specific theological debates. Sufi Muslims are interested in the mystical experience and in sharing that and in spreading that. So Akbar is no military slouch. All right, it's under him that the Mughal Empire expands deep into South Asia, up into Afghanistan. It's spreading. But the thing that he really was interested in was religion, and he actually kind of dabbles and tries his hand at creating a syncretic blend between the various religious traditions in India and Islam. We don't need to get into that. But Akbar is someone who brings Hindus into positions of political power underneath him. He abolished the jizya tax, so like the sinner's tax or the tax on non-Muslims. He abolishes that. He promotes his ideas of religious toleration, or even Hindu ideas end up in artwork that's sort of endorsed by Akbar the Great. And so his rule here in the late 1500s is seen as a high period, both militarily in terms of artistic patronage and in terms of this like very diverse place of India finding a workable system to come together under. Contrast him with Aurangzeb. Now, Aurangzeb doesn't come immediately afterwards. Akbar's policies carry on through his son. His grandson was actually the Shah Jahan, who built the Taj Mahal and has a sad ending, and it gets deposed by this guy. Now, Aurangzeb comes to power, and in a sense, he's kind of saying, guys, the party's got to be over, right? He's looking, maybe not so much at Akbar, but at the previous two rulers and saying, spending has gotten out of control here. And they've generally carried on his policies, but Aurangzeb is looking at the bottom line and saying, we're broke. And Aurangzeb is also a deeply felt Muslim. But unlike Akbar, when Aurangzeb confronts an issue, he sees a Muslim response to the issue, right? Or his response to that issue is defined by a more rigid idea of his religion than what Akbar had, and the advice of religious clerics, unlike who Akbar was receiving advice from. And so it's Aurangzeb who really cracks down on the Sikhs. It's Aurangzeb who reimposes the jizya tax, and in fact goes on to impose Sharia law, or at least attempt to impose it on much of India. And in these attempts to kind of like reestablish control, all kinds of different pockets of the Mughal Empire start flying out of his control. And so the Mughal Empire starts its breakup and its decentralizing process. And that process, you know, he's the ruler into the 1700s, and that process is really going to carry on. And that the Mughal Empire is going to decline following his like rigid and strict religious rule that causes the breakup of this empire. And following that, just so we can kind of know what are we going to look at in period 5, we're going to see India broken up into smaller provincial political units. And like I said, the British East India Company coming in and scooping these up, and later on the British Crown kind of taking them all under its jurisdiction, and Britain and India will just become the crown jewel, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. And we'll learn about all that stuff in period 5. So big things to take away. Can you describe what is the Mughal Empire in general? What were the factors or the cultural forces that influenced the Mughal Empire? Give me a word about the art or architecture of this period. And then who are the Sikhs, and Akbar and Aurangzeb? What are these two guys? What can they tell us about the life and the dynamics inside the Mughal Empire? All right, great job. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my new basement. And take care, guys. See you in class.